Well, good morning again, everyone. It is July the 19th, 2020, and we are doing Adult Sunday School again, distance from one another, so that you stay safe and I stay safe and all of that. Um, we are again looking at a book that is very seldom studied, and that would be it's really one book. The books of First and Second Chronicles, but they're really composed as one book initially, so probably the same author, same time frame. Um, Chronicles, and we just call it Chronicles from now on, is kind of what you would call maybe one of the flyover books of the Old Testament. If you think about like the flyover states in the Midwest, um, Chronicles is definitely one of those flyover books. You go like, oh, Genesis and maybe the rest of the Torah, and then, whoa, I want to get to Psalms, so I'm going to fly over a whole bunch of that stuff in the middle, because, does it really even matter that much? I don't know. Anyway, it does matter. That's the short answer. And we're going to be looking at some reasons for why it might matter as we go through the study. But I want to start off today by asking a question, because remember when we would meet in person, we'd always start off with one of those thought-provoking questions. And today's question, and I really want you to think about this, if your house were suddenly destroyed, how would you rebuild it? Even more so, what if your whole community were destroyed? Your town, your church, your neighbors' houses, everybody's place of work, everything gone. I know in Goldendale's past, we almost had that happen to us many, many moons ago, long before my time, but it was all wood and it caught on fire and it pretty much was destroyed. So I think that maybe some of the original Goldendale residents understand what that devastation can really be. But when the folks in Judah, the Jewish people, when they had this happen to them, I don't know how many of them knew that this was coming. But the sad thing is the king kind of did know that, because the prophet Jeremiah tried to warn him repeatedly, and he wouldn't listen. He had some counselors that told him a different story, and it was more to his liking, so he made the fatal mistake of listening to the wrong people, and there you have it. So Babylon came in, and a lot was changed. I'm going to read a little bit here. If you want to follow along with me in your own Bible, I'm going to read you from 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 11 to 21. So I will go ahead and put it up on the screen, but if you want to go and look for it in your own Bible, I'll give you a few minutes to do that by just kind of giving you a reminder. I'm going to see all these colors that I had in here. I did this for a class. I had to do kind of my own outline, and as I was going through it, I thought, oh, well, I should color code this just to keep things straight. So the pink is kind of just the facts stuff about, who did what and who they married and all that. The blue is any time God is part of the discussion or the action, whether people are for him, against him, whether he's helping to get them to succeed, whether they're worshiping, whatever. If God is involved, it's in blue. The yellow is military action, and that's, I think, what we're going to be seeing through this. So again, we're in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 11 to 21. And if you don't mind, I'll just read this out loud so that we all are hearing it in case you don't have your own Bible and you can't see this on the screen. Okay, starting in verse 9, it looks like, for some reason. Or this could be wrong, who knows. Okay, Jehoiachin, I think it is, was 18 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 3 months in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the Lord's eyes. In the springtime, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon sent for him to be brought to Babylon, along with valuable equipment from the Lord's temple. Then he made Zedekiah his uncle the next king of Judah and Jerusalem. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the Lord his God's eyes, and didn't submit before the prophet Jeremiah, who spoke for the Lord. Moreover, he rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, which is, by the way, never a good idea, despite the solemn pledge Nebuchadnezzar had forced him to swear in God's name. He became stubborn and refused to turn back to the Lord Israel's God. All the leaders of the priests and the people also grew increasingly unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations. They polluted the Lord's temple that God had dedicated in Jerusalem. Time and time again, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and his dwelling. But they made fun of God's messengers. That's not good either. Treating God's words with contempt and ridiculing God's prophets to such an extent that there was no hope of warding off the Lord's rising anger against his people. So God brought the Babylonian king against them. The king killed their young men with the sword in their temple's sanctuary, and showed no pity for young men or for virgins, for the old or the feeble. God handed all of them over to him, Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king hauled everything off to Babylon, every item from God's temple, both large and small, including the treasures of the Lord's temple and those of the king and his officials. Next, the Babylonians burned God's temple down, demolished the walls of Jerusalem, and set fire to all its palaces, destroying everything of value. Finally, he exiled to Babylon anyone who survived the killing, so that they could be his slaves and the slaves of his children until Persia came to power. This is how the Lord's word spoken by Jeremiah was carried out. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest. For as long as it lay empty, it rested until 70 years were completed. Wow. Well, that's pretty drastic. I don't think any of us has ever gone through anything remotely like that. It kind of puts the current pandemic thing in perspective, doesn't it? So the exiles, they're in Babylon now for 70 years. They have a long time to think about this and what's happened to them and maybe why. If you're interested in getting more of a first-hand look at that, both the books of Daniel and Ezekiel, those two prophets were in Babylon. They were part of the exiled people that went to Babylon for the 70 years. And it was not a great experience, and not a good set of memories. The other thing I wanted to do was give you kind of a, I don't know if I can get this to work. Hang on. Let's go back to, let's put me over here. I'm playing with this. All right, I'm learning. There we go. I wanted to read you a psalm that, or at least the first part of it, that was composed during the time they were in the captivity. And those of you who might remember the musical Godspell, this was one of the songs, almost verbatim, from this first couple of verses in Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." But how can we sing songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Very sad times. But after those 70 years were over, a deliverer came in the form of King Cyrus. Now you put me back here in the corner. I think I have to do that, or else it won't let me pull up the document that I want. Okay, here we go. King Cyrus comes along, and I'll read just these last couple of verses in chapter 36, verses 22 and 23. In the first year of Persia's King Cyrus, to carry out the Lord's promise spoken through Jeremiah, the Lord moved Persia's King Cyrus to issue the following proclamation throughout his kingdom, along with a written decree. This is what Persia's King Cyrus says: The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the earth's kingdoms and has instructed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Whoever among you belong to God's people, let them go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. So that was the way that the book of Chronicles ends. And as you know, if you remember my study in Romans that I did with you folks a couple years ago, I like to start at the end, because the end tells you an awful lot about what's going to come and why. And why do you suppose that the chronicler ends the action with the decree from Cyrus that they get to go back into the land again? Well, possibly it's because he's going to be looking at some of this history that leads up to this point, and he's going to be putting his stamp of perspective on it that I think will be really interesting for us to think about too. But, think about being one of those folks that came back again. And if you're interested in yet another list, if the genealogies in Chronicles weren't enough for you, you can go and look in Ezra chapter 2, because Ezra lists at least some of the people who returned. And I think I said last time, not everybody chose to return to Jerusalem. Some of them had settled in Babylon. They were pretty happy there, and God had no real problem with that. He told them to make lives for themselves in Babylon, so they weren't being disobedient if they stayed. But many did return, and as I said, if you look in Ezra chapter 2, you'll see a listing of that. Well then, looking at the land those folks saw when they returned, it must have been kind of a shock. Everything was rubble, probably somewhat overgrown. Only the farmers remained, because they were the ones that had never been carted off in the first place. They were the unskilled or semi-skilled, or whatever you want to say. They weren't well-to-do, well-born, wealthy, whatever. They didn't go to Babylon. They stayed in Judah, and they farmed and probably raised crops for the empire and subsistence kinds of things. A lot had to be done. So remember our question in the beginning: how would you rebuild your house or your town or whatever if you came home and found it was all destroyed? Well, we can read in Nehemiah in particular that there was some work on the structure, the gates, the walls around Jerusalem. And if we read in Ezra, there was a lot of discussion of rebuilding of the temple. But that wasn't the only thing that needed to be rebuilt after all that time. The chronicler tells us that people needed to know their own history again. And he doesn't tell us that directly, but we can tell by reading the book of Chronicles that he definitely has that as his purpose in writing. We are almost positive he's of the priestly class, and if for no other reason, then he can read and write. And back then, mostly the priests and the Levites were the only ones who knew how to write, or did write, more than simple business transaction kinds of stuff. And the other thing too is that I asked my professor this question, and he didn't know the answer. When these folks were carted off to Babylon. Did they have a chance to bring any texts